There was a secret international network. It was active over 3,000 years ago, and then we lost all knowledge of it for centuries. The story of how we found it again, that story depends on a puzzle, one of the greatest linguistic puzzles in history, and by the end you'll see how one message, one deciphered message, rewrote everything. The history of the ancient world, how a clay tablet buried in Egyptian sand proved something, that empires from the Nile to the Euphrates were talking. Constantly, what system did they use? What kind of trust, what protocols let kings negotiate across those distances, vast distances, dangerous ones? The answer shows a prehistoric era, an era of globalization. Stunning, really. So what's the most important message ever sent? In the ruins of a city built by the Pharaoh Akhenaten, they found a library. It wasn't Egyptian. It was hundreds of clay tablets marked with cuneiform, the letters. And when archaeologists found them, it was confusing. Diplomatic mail for an Egyptian pharaoh, but in a foreign script, stored in this abandoned city, dedicated to one radical sun god. The tablets were proof of contact over long distances. They listed gifts, gold, lapis lazuli. They recorded complaints, delayed shipments, ambassadors being disrespectful. They named other kings the rulers of empires. Assyria, Babylon, they called each other great kings. But the language, that was the first lock. The script was cuneiform from Mesopotamia, but the language was Akkadian. It was the diplomatic language of the time, like Latin. Scholars could read the script, but the language was difficult, a specialized dialect, full of courtly phrases, obscure idioms. And then there were the glosses, little notations next to certain words, hints written in a different language, unknown, like marginal notes in a secret code right there beside the text. The archive was a signal. It meant a postal service existed, trusted messengers, a shared written protocol. Kings weren't isolated. They were in constant conversation, negotiating marriages, trading treasures, navigating alliances from the Aegean Sea to the Persian Gulf. The letters gave the raw data, the who, the what, the players and their transactions. But the how did this system work so smoothly across such vast and treacherous geography that was still elusive? You'll break through. The key wouldn't come from Egypt. It would come from a different set of ruins far to the north, from a single perfectly preserved letter, one that spelled out the rules of the game. The medium was the message. A clay tablet fresh from the scribe wasn't just a letter, it was a physical artifact, a durable record of diplomacy, something you could hold, and the marks on it weren't simple writing. They were cuneiform. The word means wedge-shaped, and that's how it looks. A scribe takes a reed, presses the corner into soft clay, leaves a triangular impression. A single wedge. Combine these wedges in different patterns, you get signs. Hundreds of them. That's the challenge for anyone trying to crack this. Our alphabet has 26 letters. Each one is a sound. Cuneiform wasn't that simple. It was a hybrid system, a toolkit for writing multiple languages. Some signs were logograms, one sign for an entire word. A picture of a star could mean star, or heaven, or a god, but other signs were syllabic. They represented sounds, ba, al, tim, and a single sign could do both, a word in one context, a syllable in another. The script in the letters was a specific flavor, Akkadian cuneiform. Akkadian was the international language, like English is today, but think of a formal, old-fashioned English. The scribes writing these letters weren't in Babylon. They were in Egypt, in Canaan. They learned Akkadian as a second language. So the letters have local influences, strange spellings, unique phrases. It's like a diplomatic memo written by someone who learned English from a strict ancient textbook, then mixed in words from their mother tongue. To decipher this, you couldn't just learn a dictionary. You had to get inside the mind of an ancient scribe, understand the pressure, drafting correspondence for a king. Every wedge had to be perfect. It followed strict protocols, opening formulas praising the other king's health. Elaborate gift lists, flowery language masking serious demands. The script was a shadow of a sophisticated world, a world with its own rules, its own shared understanding. And for centuries that world was silent, until someone learned to listen to the whispers in the clay. The stone gave us a key to hieroglyphs, a single slab, the same text in 3 scripts. For the letters there was no such thing, no neat translation side by side. The key to this wasn't one object. It was a puzzle solved in pieces over decades by minds working across continents. The first cracks appeared far from Egypt in Persia. Scholars looked at massive inscriptions on cliffs, texts carved by kings like the Great. These were trilingual, the same royal proclamations in 3 different cuneiform scripts: Old Persian, Elamite, and a third, more complex one. That third script was ancient Akkadian, used by Babylon and Assyria. By comparing the known Old Persian with the unknown Akkadian, pioneers like and later began to map the symbols to sounds. They were deciphering the alphabet of empire. But the formal Akkadian of a Persian monument was still a world away from the language of diplomacy. The letters weren't carved in stone. They were written in clay in a hurry by scribes for whom Akkadian was a professional tool. To understand their shorthand, their quirks, scholars needed more. They needed a library, and they found one. In the 19th century, excavations at Assyrian capitals like Nineveh uncovered entire rooms of clay tablets, tens of thousands. Literary works, legal contracts, medical texts, and dictionaries compiled by the Assyrians themselves. This was the effort that turned the lock. By studying this archive, linguists could finally hear the language as it was used. They built a picture of Akkadian grammar. They filled volumes with vocabulary. They saw how it changed over centuries. This deep mastery was the real stone. It provided the toolkit. So when a scholar picked up a tablet and saw an odd phrase or a strange sign, they didn't hit a dead end. They could cross-reference. They could think like an ancient scribe, recognize a Hittite king's name spelled with an Egyptian accent, see a Canaanite word scribbled in the margin. The letters began to speak, not just in general terms, but in specific detail. What they said revealed not just a network, but the machinery that made it run. That deep understanding of the language let the letters speak. But to follow the conversation, you had to know the rules of the room. That's where a different kind of expert came in: the Assyriologist. They weren't just translators. They were interpreters of culture, detectives of diplomacy. Their work was slow. They'd compare hundreds of letters side by side. And in all those wedge-shaped marks, patterns started to show. It was like overhearing 100 phone calls and noticing everyone begins the same way. They saw the rigid structure. Every letter opened with a set formula. Thus says the great king, the son, my brother. To the great king, my brother, say thus. This wasn't just politeness, it was protocol. A shared code that set the rank, the relationship, the intent right from the start. The body of the letter had its own logic. There were standard phrases for health. May the gods keep you well. There were elaborate, almost poetic wishes for the other king's prosperity. Then came the substance. The gift lists weren't random. They followed a clear order of value. Gold, silver, lapis lazuli, fine textiles. The amounts were exact and they meant something. A specific weight of gold wasn't just a payment, it showed respect. Or it could be the quiet pressure of a debt. Even the complaints were formulaic. Why have you delayed your messenger? Why is the gift you sent so small? My brother, you have not treated me as a great king should. These weren't emotional outbursts. They were measured diplomatic tools, using an agreed-upon language of grievance. By cracking these templates, the Assyriologists did something remarkable. They rebuilt the etiquette of a whole age. They showed that this long-distance communication wasn't improvised. It ran on a system as formal as any modern embassy. A scribe in Egypt and a scribe in Babylon were working from the same manual. This shared written language did more than carry words. It smoothed over huge cultural gaps. It created a common ground where a Hittite king and an Egyptian pharaoh could negotiate a peace treaty or arrange a royal marriage without ever meeting face to face. The language was the bridge. But what kept that bridge standing across 1,000 miles of wilderness across rival kingdoms? The answer isn't in the words. It's in the people who carried them. The translations showed something really sophisticated. It wasn't just kings writing letters. It was a closed circle, an elite club. Historians have a name for it: the Club of the Great Powers. The members were the superpowers: Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mitanni, Assyria, and Babylonia. In their letters, they didn't use titles of submission. They called each other brother. That word brother was a diplomatic term. It meant they saw each other as equals, kings of the same rank playing the same game. This was a system of formal parity. A balance of power maintained through writing. The letters show them doing everything modern states do. They arranged royal marriages, turning daughters into peace treaties. They mediated disputes between smaller states on their borders. They exchanged gifts, but these weren't just presents. They were calibrated displays. A shipment of solid gold statues from Egypt met with fine horses and lapis lazuli from Babylon. Every gift was a statement, a reaffirmation, a debt acknowledged. What the decipherment proved was that this communication wasn't occasional. It wasn't rare. It was institutional. It ran on a professional class. Scribes, trained for years in Akkadian cuneiform, drafted the documents. Then trusted messengers with armed escorts carried the clay tablets across hundreds of miles, from the Nile Delta to Anatolia, across the Syrian desert. This was a postal service for empires. The discovery shattered the old image of ancient states as isolated kingdoms, staring suspiciously at the horizon. Instead, it showed a deeply interconnected landscape, a prehistoric diplomatic summit constantly in session, mediated by clay. The Great Powers Club had its own rules, its own language, its own rhythms. But this system didn't run on goodwill. It ran on something more tangible, a shared need and a shared fear. The stability of their whole world depended on those messengers. So what happened when a messenger was delayed or a gift fell short? The letters show that too. The system had a way of handling strain, and its breaking points show how fragile that first age of globalization really was. So the question is, why Akkadian? You have the Pharaoh in Egypt, considered a living god in his palace. His scribes are writing a letter to the king of Babylon. They could use hieroglyphs, their own sacred script, but they don't. They press wedges into clay, using a language from Mesopotamia 1,000 miles away. That was the second big thing the decipherment showed. Akkadian wasn't just a language, it was a tool, the necessary tool for running a connected world. It was like the English of that era, the accepted neutral medium for diplomacy, for trade, for high-stakes negotiation. That choice was deeply strategic. Every major power in that circle had a different native language. The Hittites had theirs, the Egyptians had theirs. The Canaanites, the people of Mitanni. If every king insisted on his own script, communication would break down into chaos. Misunderstandings would be constant, trust would be impossible, so they adopted a common standard. Akkadian became the operating system for international relations, and that tells you something about the people who made it work. The scribes. These weren't just clerks. They were the elite technocrats of the ancient world, highly trained linguists, often bilingual or trilingual. A scribe in the Egyptian court probably grew up speaking Egyptian, but for years he'd trained in a scribal school, mastering the complex cuneiform signs, the intricate grammar of diplomatic Akkadian. His job was translation in the deepest sense. He had to take the pharaoh's demands, rooted in Egyptian ideas of kingship, and put them into the formal, flowery phrases of Akkadian court language. He had to make sure a gift list was precisely. He had to frame a complaint about delayed shipments using the right diplomatic tone, not too weak, not too insulting. One mistranslated word could upset a delicate alliance. The decipherment of those letters lets us see this professional class in action. You can spot the subtle fingerprints of their training, the standard formulas they all used, how they spelled foreign names, even the little notes in the margin, often a scribe's reminder to himself. A Canaanite word written next to its Akkadian equivalent, a cheat sheet for clarity. That shared linguistic training created an international civil service. A scribe from and a scribe from Egypt, though they might never meet, were products of a similar education. They thought about communication in the same structured way. That common ground reduced friction. It let a Babylonian king read an Egyptian letter and understand not just the words, but the subtext, the expectations, the rules of the game. It fostered a stable, even if fiercely competitive international order. For a time, the language itself kept the peace. But a system this formal, this dependent on perfect protocol, has a weakness. It assumes everyone is playing by the same rulebook. And you have to ask, what happens when someone decides the rules no longer apply? The letters went beyond politics. They were about things: gold, silver, that blue stone, lapis lazuli, ivory, fine linen, horses, even doctors. The lists are so detailed. One letter from the king of Babylon to the pharaoh mentions 570 gold vessels, 10,000 linen garments, and a request for ebony wood. This wasn't generosity, it was something else. Reading these inventories gave us the third big insight. The economy of that time was built on this communication. What we used to call gift-giving was actually a formal system. International trade, a kind of economic diplomacy. A great king's standing was measured by what he could send out and what he got back. A small gift or a poor one that wasn't just an insult, it was a breach, a sign the relationship was cooling, that the balance was shifting. So when the pharaoh sent 20 gold-plated chariots to the Hittite king, that was a statement. It said, "I see your status, our alliance is strong, my workshops can make this." And in return, the Hittite king might send 200 pounds of silver and a team of prized horses. This constant, calibrated exchange created a deep interdependence. The letters are full of specific requests that map out ancient supply chains. The king of that's modern Cyprus, he writes to the Pharaoh of Egypt. He apologizes. He's only sending 200 units of copper this year. He blames a hardship in his land, an illness that hit the workforce. He promises 500 next year. In another letter, the Pharaoh asks the king of Mitanni for lapis lazuli, that bright blue stone that only came from mines in Afghanistan. Think about that. A ruler in Egypt is keeping an inventory that includes copper from an island in the Mediterranean and precious gems from Central Asia. This communication network was the backbone for all of it. It wasn't just kings showing off. It was how raw materials moved across continents, how wealth got distributed, how empires got resources they couldn't find at home. Deciphering these lists completely changed how we see Bronze Age economics. It proved that long-distance communication was essential for managing these complex, intercontinental supply chains. The world of the great powers was economically smaller and far more connected than we thought. But a system this intricate, one that depends so much on perfect reciprocity, it has a critical weakness. It only works if everyone agrees on the value of the gifts. And what happens when the value of a promise suddenly falls apart? The system was built on trust, and trust moved on 2 feet. Every clay tablet had a messenger behind it. Deciphering the script gave us the words, but it also gave us the people, the network that carried those words. These weren't just couriers. They were elite envoys, nobles, high-ranking officials. They carried the physical tablet, but they also carried more. They memorized an oral compliment, nuances, tones, confidential details, things too sensitive to press into clay. They traveled for months across deserts, through mountain passes, into foreign courts where they stood alone, representing their king's voice. The letters show concern for these men. Kings write, "Protect my messenger, provide for him." One pharaoh demands safe passage through a vassal state. He warns of severe consequences if his man is harmed. Another king complains bitterly when a messenger is detained. He sees it as a hostile act. Translating these passages showed the system's fragility. It wasn't just about the durability of baked clay. It was about the endurance of the human body, the trust placed in a stranger's hospitality, the memory of an envoy holding a king's unspoken intent for half a year. This was the physical internet of the Bronze Age. The data packets were men. Their safe passage was the protocol. A delayed messenger meant more than a late letter. It meant a broken link, a silence that could spiral into suspicion, a missed shipment of grain. The entire structure of diplomatic language, gift exchange, it balanced on the shoulders of these travelers. They were the living guarantee. The guarantee that the words in the clay meant something, that a promise made in Babylon would be honored in Egypt. Their journeys added a human dimension to long-distance communication. It was risky, exhausting work. Think of the stress. Arriving in an alien court after months on the road, having to recall every memorized phrase perfectly, interpreting the other king's demeanor, deciding what to share from memory and what to hold back. The messenger was the system's most critical component, and its most vulnerable. So what happened when the roads became unsafe? When the journeys became impossible, the letters, toward the end, began to show the strain. And the silence that followed was profound. The message was more than the words, it was the object itself. The technology they used, this Bronze Age diplomatic pouch, was made of baked earth. A scribe would write the main letter on a damp clay tablet. Then to protect it, he'd take another layer of soft, fresh clay and wrap it completely around the first one, like an envelope. But this envelope wasn't blank. Before it dried, he'd inscribe it again. This outer text wasn't a full copy, it was a summary. The address, the key points, it often named the sender and the recipient right on the outside. From the great king of to the great king of Egypt, his brother. That was the ancient subject line, so the receiving court would know immediately the letter's importance, its origin, without even breaking the seal. And the seal was everything. While the outer clay was still soft, the sender would press his cylinder seal into it. This small stone cylinder, carved with unique symbols and the king's name, was rolled across the surface. It left a continuous, intricate impression, a physical signature, a stamp of authority you couldn't forge without the actual cylinder. To open the letter, the recipient had to break that outer shell. Shattering the seal was the final act of receipt. It meant the message had arrived intact. Unread by anyone else along the journey, it was a system of authentication. The clay envelope was the encrypted wrapper. The cylinder seal was the private key. Breaking it was the decryption. Reading these outer texts gave scholars another layer. Sometimes the summary on the outside clarified a damaged passage inside. It confirmed identities. It showed the careful hierarchy. A letter from a vassal king to the pharaoh might have a simpler, more deferential summary. A letter between two brother kings would proclaim that equality right on the envelope. This physical process tells us they were engineers of trust. They understood the vulnerabilities. A message could be intercepted, altered, lost, so they built verification into the medium itself. The weight and durability of the clay were also part of the message. This wasn't a fragile scroll. It was a substantial object. You held the weight of a king's words in your hands. It could survive a fall from a horse, a rainstorm, desert heat. It was designed to last because the agreements were meant to last. Sending this heavy, sealed package was a statement. It said, "My words are permanent. My promise is solid as this clay." In an age before digital signatures, they achieved a remarkable level of security through material design. The medium wasn't just a carrier, it was a participant, a silent guarantor of the words inside. And when that guarantor failed, when a seal arrived broken, the letters show the diplomatic fury that followed. Any system gets tested at its limits. The archive isn't just diplomacy in calm times, it's also crisis. How these kings used their shared language in the darkest hours. War, betrayal, illness, it's all there in the clay. The letters show the network straining but holding under that pressure. One set of tablets shows a border dispute spiraling. A vassal king writes to the pharaoh, pleading for military support. Towns seized, fields burned. His language is desperate. He calls the pharaoh his son, his only protector. The pharaoh's reply from another tablet is measured. It doesn't promise armies. It tells the vassal to send more detailed reports. Name the specific villages under attack. Quantify the losses. The pharaoh is using the formal channel to gather intelligence, to assess from a distance before committing. That's crisis management through written protocol, slowing down the rush to war with requests for data. Then there's another case. A king accuses his royal brother of treachery. The letter is controlled fury. It follows all the polite formulas, the greetings, the wishes for health, then it delivers a devastating allegation. It claims the other king's agents were caught spying, sowing discord. The writer doesn't scream. He uses the formal language of grievance to present what he calls evidence. He demands an explanation. That's how you de-escalate a potential catastrophe with words. You frame the accusation within the shared rules of the club. You give the other king a way to save face, to reply with his own formal explanation, rather than reaching for the sword. And then the most haunting crises in the letters are the silent ones. The mentions of a sweeping illness. Scholars see anxious inquiries from one court to another. Is all well with your land? The replies are somber. They speak of a hardship, a malaise. Many researchers think these are references to the same pandemic that later ravaged the Hittite Empire. The kings shared this grim news through their channels. They weren't just exchanging pleasantries. They were gathering intelligence about a threat that respected no borders. A king hearing of plague next door could close trade routes, quarantine messengers, take steps to protect his own people. That changes how you see the network. It wasn't a luxury for exchanging gold and lapis lazuli. It was critical infrastructure for survival. The ability to send a formal warning across a continent could save thousands of lives. The ability to receive a plea and mobilize a shipment of grain or medicine could sustain an ally. In a turbulent world of shifting alliances and unseen threats, this long-distance communication was the nervous system of civilization. It allowed for coordinated response. It turned isolated crises into shared challenges. The system, at its best, didn't just facilitate trade, it managed risk on a continental scale. But a nervous system is only as strong as its connections. And what happens when the connections themselves begin to fail, one by one, plunging the whole network into a silence it never recovers from? Even the most elegant system fails sometimes. The shared language, the formal protocols, they couldn't remove human error or ambition. The letters themselves show these breakdowns. They show where the smooth surface of diplomacy cracked, and you see the frustration underneath. There's a famous complaint from a pharaoh, probably the third, writing to a vassal ruler in Canaan. It's about a shipment of statues. The pharaoh's words are blunt and deeply unimpressed. He writes that the statues sent to him weren't made of silver as promised. They were, in his exact phrase, not silver but lead. The difference isn't just value. Silver was a prestige metal, gleaming, pure, fit for a god-king. Lead was dull, heavy, common to the pharaoh. This wasn't a shipping error. It was a profound insult, a breach of the unspoken contract behind all these exchanges. The gift reflected the giver's respect. A lead statue sent in place of silver signaled disrespect, or worse, deception. The vassal might have kept the real silver for himself, sent a cheap substitute, hoping the distant pharaoh wouldn't notice. Or maybe there was a genuine production problem, a shortage the vassal was too afraid to report. We only hear the pharaoh's side. But that one line, not silver but lead, echoes across centuries. A perfect snapshot of a communication failure. The system delivered the complaint, but it couldn't stop the grievance from happening. Other letters show quieter misunderstandings. A king might list the gifts he's sending, the weight of gold, the number of horses. The reply months later expresses gratitude, but adds a pointed note. The horses weren't as fine as described. The lapis lazuli was a paler blue, a lower grade. These aren't just negotiations over value, they're clashes of expectation. A color described in one court might not match the mental image in another. A fine horse in one kingdom might be average elsewhere. The shared Akkadian language provided the dictionary, but it couldn't guarantee a shared standard of quality. The trust was fragile. Every delayed caravan, every subpar shipment chipped away at it. The letters show kings constantly reassuring each other, reaffirming their brotherhood, precisely because that trust needed constant maintenance. It was a system running on faith, and faith is vulnerable to doubt. This points to a deeper limit. Whose voices do we actually hear in this archive? Almost exclusively the powerful, the great kings and their immediate vassals. The club was exclusive by design. The vast majority of people, farmers, artisans, traders in small towns, are silent. Their experiences are invisible, unless they impacted a king's interests. A village might have its own barter network with a neighboring valley. But if it didn't involve lapis lazuli or gold, it wouldn't merit a clay tablet for a royal archive. Our view is a view from the palace, shaped entirely by the priorities of the elite who controlled the scribes. Sometimes we catch a fleeting glimpse of these silent communities, when a vassal king writes about a rebel uprising, or a raid by nomadic tribes. He's reporting on people with no direct access to the network. Their story is told through his lens, and he has his own reasons for framing events a certain way. The network itself became a tool of hierarchy. The ability to send a formal complaint to a distant superpower was a privilege of status. A smaller kingdom caught between two great powers might send desperate letters to both, trying to play them against each other, its voice a small, strategic whisper in a hall of shouting giants. This selective visibility is a crucial reminder. The Bronze Age world was interconnected, but it was not flat. It was a landscape of steep peaks and deep valleys. The dazzling long-distance connections between royal courts existed alongside countless local, invisible networks. The clay tablets map the superhighways of elite exchange, but they leave the local footpaths in darkness. The system that redefined communication was also a system that decided whose communication mattered. It centralized control over the narrative of the age. And when the peaks those networks connected began to crumble, the silence that fell was absolute, leaving future civilizations to wonder if such a world had ever existed at all. The story doesn't end in the palace. That same technology, the one that carried royal decrees, also carried something else, something more ordinary. And in a way, more revealing. Because for every letter between pharaohs, there were hundreds of private letters, business letters. They used the same script, the same cuneiform wedges pressed into the same clay, but these weren't about treaties. They weren't about royal marriages. They were about wool and tin and profit. The proof of that comes from a different set of ruins. Far to the north of Egypt in central Anatolia, there's a place called. For centuries, it was a merchant colony, a busy trading hub. And when archaeologists dug there, they didn't find royal archives. They found family records, Assyrian merchant families who had traveled from their homeland hundreds of miles away to set up shop. They lived in a foreign city. They spoke a foreign language, and they kept their business running through letters. A constant stream of letters sent back home, thousands of them. They were the private heartbeat of the Bronze Age economy. Deciphering those tablets was its own kind of revelation. It showed that long-distance communication wasn't just a privilege for kings. It was a practical tool, a tool for commerce. A merchant would write to his brother or his partner back in the city of. The letters are incredibly detailed. They're full of numbers. They list shipments of fine textiles, these luxurious woolen fabrics that were traded for Anatolia's big resource, tin and copper, the essential ingredients for bronze. They discuss market prices, exchange rates between silver and gold, shipping costs, storage fees. They argue about quality. One letter might complain that a batch of wool was poorly dyed, that it couldn't be sold for a premium. Another might give instructions to delay a tin shipment until the prices rise. The format is familiar. They open with formal greetings, to the family, to the gods. Then they get straight to business. They end with instructions and assurances, and they used a trusted carrier system, commercial couriers, often traveling in the same caravans that moved the goods. The letter and the shipment were two parts of the same transaction. The clay tablet was everything. The receipt, the invoice, the contract, the management memo, all in one. This parallel network operated with a similar efficiency to the royal one. It used standardized formats because time was money. A merchant needed his partner back in to understand an order instantly, without confusion. A mistake in reading a number could mean ruin, so they developed their own shorthand, their own commercial jargon inside the Akkadian language. They wrote about trust and credit in very real terms. Your reputation as a reliable correspondent, a man whose word in clay could be trusted, that was your most valuable asset. So the breakthrough in reading Akkadian didn't just unlock the diplomacy of kings. It unlocked the ledger books, the records of entrepreneurs. It revealed a second tier of long-distance communication, just as sophisticated, just as vital to the era's connectedness. The royal letters show us the superstructure, the alliances, the grand strategies. The merchant letters show us the foundation, the daily grinding work of exchange that made those kingdoms wealthy enough to have grand strategies in the first place. Together, they give you the complete picture. Written communication permeated this society, from the top to the bottom. It drove politics at the highest level, and it drove the economy at the most grassroots level. A pharaoh negotiating for lapis lazuli and a merchant haggling over a load of tin were using the same revolutionary tool. They were turning spoken promises into permanent records, transferable records. They were building trust across distances they couldn't see. That was the true redefinition. Communication wasn't just for declaring war or peace. It was for building a world where a deal made in one mountain town could depend on a letter read in a desert city months later. The system worked because it had to. And when that system finally failed, the silence was so complete we almost forgot it was ever there. The writing was the revolution. Before those clay tablets, a king's word couldn't be kept. Complex agreements, trade deals, treaty terms, they only lived in memory. They depended on witnesses, on elders' stories, on spoken oaths. Memory is remarkable, but it's fragile. It changes with each telling, it fades, it can be contested. What these letters show is the shift writing brought. It let information exist outside the mind, to become an object. A clay tablet wasn't just a message. It was a memory made solid. That externalization changed everything. It extended authority. A pharaoh in Thebes could issue a command, and a year later his governor in a distant Canaanite city would read it unchanged. It didn't rely on a messenger's recall, it was the command. The physical tablet carried the king's will. It created a new kind of power that could travel across continents, persist across generations. Commerce, too. A merchant's promise to deliver 500 units of tin was no longer a handshake. It was a list pressed into clay, signed with his seal. That record could be held, examined, presented as proof. It built a new trust not just between two people, but between two systems that recognized the written record. That's the cognitive leap. Humanity began to offload complex information, to store it in a medium that didn't forget, didn't age, didn't distort. A treaty between the Hittites and Egyptians wasn't just a ceremony. It was a detailed document onto silver tablets. The terms were fixed, the borders described. The obligations listed. Future kings could point to that object and say, "This is the agreement. Our ancestors made it. We are bound by it." Writing turned fleeting speech into permanent law. It turned a deal into a contract. It turned a king's wish into an order that could be sent to a dozen cities at once. This external hard drive for society's data was the silent prerequisite for everything else. You can't manage a far-flung empire by oral decree alone. You can't run an intercontinental trade network on memory. The logistics would collapse. The disputes would be endless. The clay tablet and the shared language on it provided the blueprint. It allowed standardization, verification, a continuity that outlasted any ruler or merchant. It altered the architecture of ancient society, built a framework stable enough to connect the Nile to the Tigris. When that framework finally fell, the written records became the only proof that such a connected world had ever been built at all. A literal translation could trap you, because the words on the clay were just the surface. Underneath there was this whole current of unspoken meaning, a language inside the language. To really get these messages, there had to be more than linguists. They had to be poets and psychologists, because Bronze Age diplomacy was a performance, a delicate theater. Every line was rehearsed. The kings weren't just sending facts. They were managing a story, a shared story about honor and power and mutual respect. And a single metaphor, if it was misplaced, could shatter that whole illusion. Take the most common greeting. One king calls another "my brother, the sun." On the surface, it's a flowery compliment, but you unpack it. Brother, that establishes parity, that crucial equality within the club of great powers, and the sun, that's a divine reference. It acknowledges the other king's godlike radiance, his authority. So it's not just a hello, it's a full diplomatic statement. It says, I see you as my equal, and I acknowledge your glorious power. To translate that as dear friend would lose the entire political framework, the whole foundation of the relationship. And the metaphors got even richer. Kings might reference mythological bonds, comparing their alliance to the unbreakable ties between ancient gods. They might describe their longing for a message as a thirst in the desert. This wasn't idle poetry, it was a sophisticated code. Using these shared cultural references reinforced a common worldview. It reminded the recipient they were part of the same elite club, the same education, the same values. It built rapport through artistry. But the real test for a translator came with the subtle insult. Because outright hostility was rare, the art was in weaving criticism into the fabric of a polite request. A king might write, "Why, my brother, have you treated me with contempt?" That word contempt is a loaded charge. It implies a deliberate public slight against honor, but it's framed as a question, a plea for clarification. It gives the other king an escape route. He can deny the intent, blame a misunderstanding, and restore the relationship. So the insult is delivered, but the door for reconciliation is left open. Or consider the complaint about gift quality. A pharaoh doesn't just say the statues were bad. He says, "You sent me statues that were not silver but lead." The insult isn't in calling it lead. It's in the explicit comparison to what was promised. It highlights the gap between expectation and reality, between the glory of silver and the baseness of lead. It accuses the other king of failing to live up to the standards of their shared world. The translator has to feel the sting in that juxtaposition. Deciphering this layer meant a deep dive into the unspoken rules. Scholars had to study hundreds of letters to understand what was a standard formula and what was a deliberate deviation. A slightly colder greeting, a missing wish for the queen's health, a less elaborate gift list than the last exchange. These were diplomatic signals, a quiet cooling of relations. The scribes were masters of this subtext. They knew how to amplify a compliment with extra metaphors, or how to soften a demand with extra layers of flattery. And this reveals the ultimate purpose, this long-distance communication. It wasn't primarily about moving goods or troops, though it did that. It was about constantly tending to the fragile ecosystem of honor between empires. Every letter was a ritual, a reaffirmation of status, a calibration of respect. The clay tablet carried the weight of a king's entire reputation across the mountains and deserts. So a successful translation isn't just about finding the right words. It's about hearing the tone of voice in a silent script. It's about perceiving the careful dance. Two rulers, separated by 1,000 miles, performing their friendship for each other and for the ages. And sometimes that performance would break down completely, revealing the raw ambition and fear the poetry usually concealed. The letters weren't just moving through the air. They were moving across the ground, over actual mountains, actual rivers, real deserts. And once you could read the names of the cities, the complaints about how long it took, you could do something. You could draw lines on a map. The messages themselves became a guide to the infrastructure. They showed the physical cables, the roads, the sea lanes, the mountain passes, So a messenger going from Egypt to the Hittite capital, that wasn't some vague trek, it was a scheduled route. We know because the letters list the stops. A king writes, "My messenger left Memphis, he passed through, he should be in 40 days. Why is he late? These weren't guesses. They were expectations, based on a known timetable, a known geography. The main land route was this great arc of fertile land. The Fertile Crescent, that was the superhighway. From the Nile Delta you'd go northeast into Canaan. Follow the coastal plain, past places the letters name as waypoints, then you turn inland up through the valleys of Syria. And here were the major relay stations, cities like Ugarit. These weren't just kingdoms, they were hubs where caravans would rest, resupply, transfer messages. The letters show these cities were obligated by treaty to provide food and shelter. Safe passage. A vassal who failed to protect a pharaoh's courier could expect a stern reply. But the land wasn't gentle. Beyond the valleys was the Syrian desert, a vast arid barrier. Crossing it directly was a gamble, a deadly one. So the main route skirted the northern edge, followed the Euphrates River down into Babylonia. That path took months, it was a test. The letters hint at the dangers, nomadic tribes, scarcity of water, the exhaustion. The very fact this communication existed presumed political stability along the whole corridor. Local kings had to be kept in line, or the chain would break. And then there was the sea. The Aegean, the Eastern Mediterranean, they weren't barriers, they were connectors. The letters from Cyprus prove a busy maritime network. Ships carried copper, they also carried clay tablets. A sea voyage from Canaan to Anatolia could be faster than overland. Though riskier, storms, pirates, port cities like Ugarit become crucial nodes. Excavations there found the actual infrastructure, warehouses, docks, archives holding letters from Egypt, all in one place. So the tablets told us what was moving. The archaeology showed us the ports where the transfer happened. That combination makes the picture complete. The text gives us the names, Ugarit, Babylon. Archaeology finds the walls, the gates, the storage jars at those same sites. The letters complain about a delayed caravan. Archaeology finds a burned, suggesting a raid. This material network was a living thing, a fragile thing. It required constant maintenance. Roads had to be patrolled. Innkeepers at remote posts had to be paid, compelled to be hospitable. Ships had to be built, manned. The messengers walking these paths were navigating a landscape of cooperation and danger. Their safe passage was the most critical investment these empires made. Because without the physical journey, the system of written protocols was just words on a shelf. The clay tablet was a product of this geography. It started as mud from a riverbank, was inscribed in a palace, then spent months in a leather pouch, bouncing on a donkey's back, feeling the salt spray of the sea, before reaching another palace far away. Its journey was the silent physical truth behind every diplomatic promise. And when the geography itself became hostile, when the roads crumbled, the sea lanes closed, that journey became impossible. The messages stopped moving. And the network, for all its sophistication, just vanished. Into the landscape it once mastered, the peak was this brilliant, fleeting moment. Those letters from the 14th century BCE, they show a world in full conversation. But if you follow the script forward, the tone shifts. The later texts from the 12th century tell a different story, a story of static. The signal starts to break up. That language of brotherhood, of shared protocol, it begins to fray. And in the correspondence, you hear a new note, a rising note of alarm. These later letters, they speak of movements, of displaced groups pressing against borders. They mention more and more a force the scribes called the Sea Peoples. The term is vague. It's a catch-all for disruption arriving from the sea and the hinterlands. But the effects in the letters are clear. A king writes that his coastal cities are burning. Another pleads for emergency grain, his supply lines cut. The formal language of diplomacy strains under the weight of crisis. The complaints aren't about the quality of gold statues anymore. They're about survival. What you see here is the network coming under intolerable stress. The very geography that once carried messengers safely, the coastal roads, the fertile valleys, it becomes a corridor for conflict. Are overrun. Caravans can't get through. A desperate message might be sent, but there's no guarantee a reply comes back. The trust built over centuries, the expectation of a response, it begins to evaporate. Silence becomes the new normal, a terrifying normal, and with the great palaces burning from in Greece to in Anatolia, the institutions that supported the system vanished. The scribal schools, where generations learned diplomatic Akkadian, were gone. The kings who called each other brother were deposed. The professional class of envoys and translators was scattered. In that chaos, the Lingua Franca lost its reason for being. There was no one left to write in it, no one of status left to read it. That redefinition of long-distance communication, so revolutionary, it proved to be conditional. It wasn't a permanent upgrade. It was a brilliant adaptation to a specific, stable world. A greenhouse flower that couldn't survive the frost. When the political and economic ecosystems that nourished it collapsed, the system died with them. The clay tablets, baked hard in kilns or in the fires of sacked cities, they became something new, not active messages, fossils. The only testament to a connected age that later civilizations would struggle to believe was even possible. The silence that followed lasted for centuries. A dark age where writing itself retreated. The networks shrank from continental to local. The idea of a great king in Egypt sending a formal complaint to a brother in Babylon would have seemed like a forgotten myth. The world had grown large and dangerous again, and the memory of that first global conversation was buried literally in the dust, waiting for the curiosity of a much later age to piece the story back together. One wedge-shaped sign at a time, the Bronze Age system of clay tablets and messengers. It's not a distant idea. It's a kind of ancient internet, a global web running on a different hardware. The comparison is functional. It shows the architecture of long-distance communication has deep roots. First, a common language, a protocol. In our world, that's TCP/IP, the rules that let a device in Tokyo talk to a server in Texas. Different companies, different software, but they agree on the basic handshake. In the Bronze Age, that protocol was Akkadian cuneiform, a Hittite scribe, an Egyptian scribe. They used the same script, the same diplomatic formulas. That shared protocol let different political systems, different gods, different customs exchange data. The royal courts were servers, centralized hubs processing requests, storing records. Merchant houses like inn were clients, sending information, updating ledgers. And the messengers, men traveling for months, they weren't just carriers, they were the living data packets, moving along established routes, the physical cables of this ancient web. A data packet has a header with addressing information. The clay envelope had its own header, the summary on the outside, naming sender and recipient, the cylinder seal pressed into the clay. That was the ancient encryption, the authentication. Breaking that seal to read the inner tablet was the final step, verifying the message's integrity, proving the data packet hadn't been tampered with. The decipherment of those letters shows the system in action. A complaint from Babylon routing its way to Egypt, a gift list being acknowledged like a receipt confirmation. We see the system fail too. A messenger goes missing, a dropped packet. A king receives a subpar gift, corrupted data. The parallels are stunning. They speak to a constant human need to overcome distance, to build trust with someone you cannot see, to create systems that make a vast, dangerous world feel smaller, more manageable. This challenges a modern idea. We speak of our connected, globalized world as new, a product of jet aircraft and fiber optic cables. But the letters, the merchant archives, prove globalization in its essence is ancient. It's the story of humanity building structures, linguistic, diplomatic, logistical, to bridge the gaps between us. The clay tablets were the emails, the formal treaties were the cloud storage. This ancient web reminds us, our technology evolves at a breathtaking pace, but the fundamental impulses behind it, to trade, to negotiate, to share knowledge, to assert our place in a wider world, those are as old as civilization itself. The medium changes from baked earth to silicon, but the message in its deepest human form remains. Resurrecting that world needed more than just one key. It needed a whole set of tools, different disciplines working together to turn those silent marks into something we could follow. First, there was paleography, which isn't just reading old writing, it's the forensic work on the script itself. Every scribe had their own hand. Over centuries, the shapes of the cuneiform signs changed. A wedge from Hammurabi's time might look a little different from one used later in the period. Paleographers became detectives of form. They'd line up hundreds of tablets, comparing the angle of a triangle, the depth of an impression. They learned to spot regional styles, how an Egyptian-trained scribe might press the reed differently than a Babylonian. By mapping these subtle changes, they could date a tablet. They could even trace where a letter had been. If the clay and the sign shapes didn't match the supposed origin, that was a clue. Paleography gave you the physical fingerprint. Then there was the linguistics. Akkadian was a Semitic language, a distant cousin to Hebrew and Arabic. Scholars used comparative linguistics. They'd take a known word in Hebrew and look for a similar root in the undeciphered Akkadian. This was like having a few pieces of a huge puzzle and slowly inferring the shape of the pieces around them. They reconstructed the grammar. They figured out verb conjugations, noun cases, the syntax of a formal letter. But language isn't a math equation. Words have multiple meanings. Idioms get lost. That's where the third tool came in. Maybe the most powerful one, historical context. This was the reality check, the triangulation. Say a translator is working on a letter and comes across the name of a Hittite king. The spelling is odd, the grammar around it is confusing. Is it a title, an insult, a mistake? The linguist has guesses, but to check, they turn to other sources. They look at Hittite monuments, which might name that same king in their own script. They check Egyptian temple reliefs, which sometimes show foreign rulers with hieroglyphic labels. They cross-reference. If Egyptian records mention a major treaty with the Hittites in a specific year, and a letter seems to be negotiating a royal marriage around that same time, the pieces click. The historical event becomes a fixed point, a beacon. It lets the translator say, this cluster of wedges here, in this confusing sentence, must be talking about that treaty. So this verb probably means to ratify, not to reject. That method of triangulation turned speculation into something closer to science. It was a constant back and forth. Linguistics would suggest a reading. Paleography would confirm the script was from the right era for that reading. Historical context proved it made sense in the real world. A single scholar rarely had all these skills. The decipherment was a collaborative effort. An archaeologist digging at would send a sketch of a new seal to a linguist in Paris. That linguist would compare it to a phrase in a letter studied by a historian in London. Information traveled on modern networks to rebuild the ancient one. This toolkit shows you what the breakthrough really was. It wasn't a sudden eureka moment, one man and a stone. It was a slow, collective building up of knowledge. 1,000 small corrections. A debate over the meaning of a single wedge that could change how you saw an entire diplomatic relationship. It was a lesson in humility. You had to be willing to be wrong, to have your beautiful linguistic theory shattered by a pottery shard found in a new layer of dirt. The process itself is the message. It shows that understanding the past is never a straight line. It's an archaeology of meaning, built layer by patient layer. Using every tool, you have to listen to whispers from the clay. The clay tablets speak, but there's a lot they don't tell us. Deciphering the script was a triumph, but for every mystery solved, a new one took its place. Some of the most basic terms in the letters, they're still opaque. Scholars can translate a whole paragraph about a shipment, but the specific word for a type of wood or a rare dye or a ceremonial garment, that might be a complete guess. You see the word, you know it's an object of value. But its exact nature is just out of reach. It's like reading a modern inventory that lists a gadget. You understand it's important, but without seeing it, the word is just a placeholder. These untranslatable terms, they're quiet reminders. The shared Akkadian dictionary was vast, but not infinite. Local knowledge, the specific texture of a material known only to a certain region, that could slip through the cracks of the international language. And the people who wrote these words, the scribes, we know they were highly trained. You see their skill in the neat rows of wedges, but you almost never hear their personal voice. The documents are so formal, so bound by protocol, that the individual behind the stylus is invisible. Did they ever make a private joke in the margin? A sigh of frustration after a long dictation? The nature of the archive filters that humanity out. We have the official record, not the workshop chatter. An error in a tablet is usually corrected neatly, the mistake smoothed over. It leaves no trace of the moment of confusion. This is history written by professionals for the record. It's brilliant, but it's also a performance. The backstage, the unscripted moments are lost. The view is also overwhelmingly from the top. The letters are between kings or from kings to their vassals. We have precious few documents written by queens in their own right, or by the merchants' wives managing the business back home, or by the military captains on the frontier. The system of long-distance communication was an elite tool. It carried the concerns of state. The worries of a farmer whose field was raided, the gossip of a potter in a coastal town, these did not merit a clay tablet bound for a royal archive. Our window into this world is a window from the palace balcony. You see the broad sweep of the landscape, the movements of armies and caravans, but you miss the life in the streets below. Most haunting of all is the silence around the messengers themselves. We read the written words they carried, but the decipherment cannot recover the oral messages they held in memory, the confidential aside, the tone of voice they were instructed to use. A king might write, "Tell my brother the following," and then the clay tablet states a formal position. But the messenger would also be given private instructions, and make sure he understands we are serious this time. Or assure him quietly that the delay is not a sign of disrespect. That layer of communication, the live negotiation, the human nuance, it evaporated the moment the messenger spoke his last word. It's the ultimate lost layer, the flesh and blood of diplomacy gone forever. These gaps are not failures, they're the natural boundaries of our knowledge. Every historical breakthrough does two things. It illuminates a forgotten world, and in that new light it casts fresh shadows. It shows us what we can know, and in doing so defines what we cannot. The Deciphered Inscription gave us the blueprint of the system, but it also framed a new set of questions, not about kings and treaties, but about people, about the scribe's aching hand at the end of a long day, about the messenger's loneliness on a foreign road, about the unrecorded conversations that truly built trust between empires. We've recovered the magnificent machinery of connection. The lingering mystery is the quiet hum of the human hearts that made it work. A tablet wasn't just a broken piece of clay anymore. It was a page from a ledger, or a line in a treaty, a name in a court record. And once people could read that writing, cuneiform, everything in the ground around those tablets changed. The meaning changed. Archaeology in that part of the world, the Near East, it went through this quiet revolution. It shifted from looking for museum pieces to a science of context. Before, on a dig, you'd want the gold necklace, the carved statue, a clay tablet with those scratches on it. That was a curiosity. You might catalog it, you might not even keep it. Its value was just in how it looked. The message didn't matter. But once you could translate the scratches, the tablet became the key. It could unlock the whole site. The text could tell you the name of the city you were in. It could date a layer of ash to a specific invasion, one mentioned in the royal records. It could explain a room full of identical jars. That's a tax office, not a pantry. The object was still important, but its real worth was the information. And that changed why you dug. Every shard, every wall, every seed became part of a story. A story the writing started to tell. The letters show this. They weren't in a temple. They were in a modest building. And when they were read, archaeologists understood. This was the records office, the diplomatic mail room for a pharaoh. That identification, it came from the texts themselves. It gave this plain structure a profound meaning. It showed how Akhenaten's government worked, where messages came in, where copies were filed. The building's layout started to make sense. The small rooms for scribes, the storage for clay, the archaeology and the text, they illuminated each other. A scatter of tablets in a corner wasn't just collapse. It was a moment frozen. Maybe the office was abandoned in haste when the capital moved. The decipherment turned dirt and stone into a working bureaucracy. This partnership between text and trench, it rewrote the method. Now, a seal impression with a king's name could date a city gate. A receipt for 5 chariots could explain a pile of metal fittings in a workshop. Archaeology stopped being about collecting beautiful things. It became about solving puzzles, historical puzzles. The writing gave the clues. The stratigraphy, the pottery sequences, the architecture, they gave the proof. That was the real impact of cracking the code. It didn't just give us stories from the past. It taught us how to listen to the past, to see a broken wall not as rubble but as a sentence. To understand the most valuable thing in a royal palace wasn't the gold, it was the filing cabinet. The decipherment redefined communication for them. And in doing that, it redefined discovery for us. The collapse wasn't a total erasure. The great palaces fell. That international club dissolved. But its innovations didn't just vanish into the Dark Age. The core ideas of that Bronze Age system, they were like seeds carried on the wind. They found new ground. They took root in the empires that rose from the ashes. They transformed, evolved into something new but still deeply familiar. You can hear the echoes centuries later, in the roar of Assyrian chariots, in the grand proclamations of Persian kings. The Assyrian Empire, it dominated the Near East. It was a direct heir to this tradition. They spoke Akkadian, they wrote in Cuneiform, but they took the concept of centralized communication and they weaponized it. The royal court became a true nerve center. A relentless stream of reports flowed in, from provincial governors, from military commanders, from intelligence agents. These weren't diplomatic niceties. They were real-time updates on rebellions, on harvest yields, on the movements of rival powers. The Assyrian kings built a bureaucracy of unprecedented scale, one that demanded constant, reliable information over vast distances. They perfected the messenger corps, turned it into a military-style relay system with fresh horses. The goal was control, swift, brutal, informed control. The clay tablet was their tool of empire. The legacy of the period was clear. To rule a vast territory, you had to master the flow of information. Then came the Persians. Their Achaemenid empire stretched from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea. Governing such diversity required a new solution. They adopted Aramaic as their official administrative language. Aramaic was simpler. It used an alphabet, not the complex cuneiform system. It could be written on parchment or papyrus. Lighter, more portable than clay. This was a technological shift, but the underlying principle was the same. A shared linguistic protocol to unite a multilingual empire. The Persian royal road, with its guarded stations and scheduled couriers, it was the direct descendant of the Bronze Age caravan routes. Herodotus, the Greek historian, he marveled at its efficiency. He wrote that nothing in the world traveled faster than these Persian messengers. The system was so reliable, he said, they were stopped by neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night. That sentiment, that need for guaranteed communication. It would have been perfectly understood by a pharaoh complaining about a delayed envoy 1,000 years earlier. This is the profound lineage the Decipherment reveals. We can trace a direct thread from the diplomatic brotherhood of the Bronze Age, through the administrative machinery of Assyria, to the integrated infrastructure of Persia. Each empire learned, adapted, scaled the basic idea that a state is only as strong as its ability to communicate across its own territory. That trust, whether between royal brothers or between a king and his satrap, it requires a reliable medium. This long-term perspective reshapes our understanding. The redefinition of communication in the Bronze Age, it wasn't a one-time event. It was a foundational event. It established the core patterns, the need for a lingua franca, the necessity of secure channels, the professionalization of messengers, the very concept of formal, written diplomacy. These patterns became the bedrock of large-scale statecraft. They were inherited by the classical world. The Greek city-states had their heralds. The Roman Empire built its own vast road network, its imperial postal service. The blueprint was ancient. By cracking the code on those clay tablets, we did more than recover lost letters. We found the origin point of a tradition. We witnessed the moment a powerful tool was forged. A tool for building and maintaining complex human societies over impossible distances. The empires that came after, they didn't invent long-distance communication. They inherited it. They refined it. They built their worlds upon a foundation of baked clay and shared words. A foundation whose first architects we can now finally name. But these tablets, their story isn't only ancient, it has a modern chapter, and it's written in the politics of our own time. Deciphering the letters was a scholarly triumph, but it happened in a specific historical moment. The late 19th century, the early 20th. That's when many of these artifacts were dug up and removed. It was the age of empires. European museums, American museums, they funded the expeditions. And the treasures they found, these clay documents, they often ended up far from where they were made. They're in London now, Berlin, Paris, New York. So the physical evidence of this first global network, it's itself scattered across a modern global network, a legacy of a different kind of power. That raises questions, profound ethical questions. Who owns the narrative of the past? The country where the artifact was made, or the institution that preserved it, studied it for a century? This debate over cultural heritage, it's not abstract. It touches these tablets. When a museum displays a letter, it's telling a story. But the authority to tell that story, to translate those words, it's tied to the history of how it got there. And the translations themselves, they aren't neutral. Decipherment gives a voice to the dead, but it's a voice filtered through a modern lens. A scholar's interpretation can emphasize certain things. A letter about a military campaign. It could be framed as imperial glory, or it could be a record of hardship. And in regions where ancient borders map onto modern disputes, these texts can be used as evidence. The language of brotherhood between kings can be cited to suggest historical bonds. Their complaints can underscore ancient rivalries. Acknowledging this isn't a dismissal of the work. It's an essential part of the story. The breakthrough that redefined long-distance communication, it also places a responsibility on everyone who engages with it. It asks us to be aware of the context, to understand that the journey of a clay tablet from a buried archive in Egypt to a glass case in Europe, that journey is itself a piece of modern history, and it shapes how we see the ancient one. This ethical dimension adds a crucial layer to the legacy. It reminds us the past isn't a static set of facts. It's a conversation between the silent object and the inquiring mind, between the country of origin and the global community of scholars, between competing interpretations. Goal isn't a single definitive story, it's to build a richer understanding, one that respects the artifacts, honors the cultures that created them, and acknowledges the complicated path they took to reach us. So every translation, it's not an end. It's a new beginning for dialogue. If you had a stylus and a slab of damp clay, what would you write? Your message would have to be worth the journey. Months of a messenger's life, the risk, the trust. It might be a desperate plea. To the great king, my brother. Raiders from the sea have burned my towns. Send soldiers or I cannot hold. Every mark shaped by fear. Or it could be ambition dressed as courtesy. Thus says the king. I have lapis, a blue deeper than the night. Send your silver and we will both prosper. A calculated offer where every weight and measure is a negotiation, or maybe it's simpler. A merchant far from home writing to his family. The caravan is delayed. The winter here is harsh. I am well. Tell my son I will bring him a gift of Anatolian iron. The worry and the love pressed into a few lines. The tablet has a physical weight and that makes you choose your words. You can't send a dozen. You get one. Every phrase has to carry its weight. You think of the messenger memorizing your tone. The hope in your voice when you said, make him understand this is urgent. You imagine your seal, your unique mark pressed into the clay. That seal is your reputation, your word. Once it's broken open at the other end, there's no taking it back. Your message, for good or ill, now lives in another court. This isn't just imagination, it's empathy. It bridges 3,000 years. The technology is just a vessel. The clay, the stylus, the alphabet, they're tools. What fills them is always the same. The human need to reach out, to say, I am here. This is what I need. This is what I fear. This is what I offer. Whether it's carried by a man on a donkey or a pulse of light through a cable, the impulse doesn't change. We build these systems for the oldest reason, to soothe a fear, to seal a deal, to whisper across the void, are you there? And to hope for a reply. That archive of letters was the keystone. It held everything together. Before we could read them, the Bronze Age was just these silent monuments. The pyramids, the ziggurats, the huge walls at Mycenae, impressive but separate. We thought of them as achievements from different worlds. There was this idea they might be connected, a theory, but there was no proof. The letters were the proof. They turned a sketch into a map. They gave us the actual names, not just a Hittite king but the first, not just an Egyptian pharaoh but the third, and Akhenaten. And they gave us the feeling behind it, the annoyance in a complaint about some statues, the worry in a request for a physician, the careful flattery in a letter to another king. They listed the specific exchanges: 570 gold vessels, 10,000 linen garments, 200 units of copper. This wasn't a theory about trade anymore. It was an invoice, a receipt, a ledger entry that changed everything. We stopped seeing those monuments as endpoints. We started seeing them as points in a network. A pyramid wasn't just a tomb. It was a message of power sent to other kings who would hear about it through reports. The storehouses that weren't just local. They were part of a chain that could get tin from Anatolia, ivory from Syria. The decipherment redefined the era. It went from isolated kingdoms to a talking world, a world of ancient. The letters showed that long-distance communication was the nervous system. It was the essential infrastructure, not an extra but the core technology. Like a nervous system carries signals, this network carried power, economy, culture. A decision in a throne room inn could change the price of copper in Cyprus. An artistic style from Manon Creek could show up in an Egyptian palace. A religious idea from Mesopotamia could be discussed in Canaan. The exchange wasn't just goods, it was ideas. The very concepts of kingship, of diplomacy, of making treaties, they were refined and sent through these clay tablets. That's the legacy of that one decipherment. It didn't just add a chapter, it rewrote the premise. It showed that our age of globalization isn't the first. It might be the fastest, the most intense. But it's a return to a pattern, a human pattern, the pattern of building bridges, of creating shared languages, literal and diplomatic, of weaving separate places into something larger and fragile and complex. The voices from the clay tell us that the urge to connect, to reach beyond the horizon, is one of our oldest stories. And sometimes, the most important messages take 3,000 years to arrive. The decipherment is a story of human ingenuity. It belongs to two eras. There were the ancient scribes and kings, with their reeds and clay, building a network of words across a wilderness. They built a system of trust over impossible distances, a fragile web of diplomacy that held a world together. And then there are the modern scholars, the patient detectives. Centuries later, they learned to listen. They resurrected that silent conversation, wedge by wedge, from the dust. It started with a cryptic clay tablet buried in Egyptian sand, and it led to a complete redefinition. The Bronze Age is not a gallery of silent, isolated monuments. It's a time of vibrant dialogue, a time of intricate humming connection. A world where a king in Egypt could write a complaint about lapis lazuli quality to a brother in Babylon and expect a reply, where a merchant's ledger in Anatolia depended on a promise made in Assyria. It was a globalized age, running on the original internet of baked earth and human endurance. This breakthrough shows a profound truth. Communication is the bedrock of complex society. It's the essential infrastructure, more fundamental than roads or walls. Without a shared language, without reliable messengers, without the trust encoded in a cylinder seal, those great empires could not have functioned. Their economies would have stalled. Their alliances would have crumbled. Their world would have remained small and fractured. That truth echoes in our own time. We build faster networks, new protocols, instant connections. But the core human challenge is the same: to build trust across distance, to find common ground in a shared language, to ensure our messages, in whatever form, carry our true intent. The legacy of this discovery challenges us to look at the silent artifacts of the past with new wonder, to see not just a broken pot or a tumbled wall, but a potential message, a fragment of a lost conversation. Every archaeological site, every archive holds whispers. What other dialogues lie buried, waiting for their key? What other intricate systems of understanding have vanished, leaving only the faintest trace?